Hello, this is the Phil Lewis podcast, and I'm, you guessed it, Phil Lewis. Good to be with you for episode 2, and I wanted to start by saying a big thanks for all the questions, comments, and feedback that we've had about episode 1. It's been good to know that what we're doing is already making an impact. First up this time, I'm joined by Tom Cheesewright. Tom is an applied futurist, which is a way of saying that he helps organisations make sense of the future and work out what to do about it. He's also the founder of the speaker agency Pomona Partners, which is busy disrupting the lazy norms of speaker bureaus up and down the country. Tom brings to his work a sort of curiosity and openness that I've always found appealing, and it's never more so the case than in what he shares here. I found his story really quite moving, and it stayed with me for days afterwards. And I'm looking forward to hearing what you make of it and also examining some of the themes from the conversation, which I shall be doing in part 2 with another coach and consultant called Kayleigh Basford. Tom, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Phil. Nice to be here.
What story have you got for us today?
Anybody who's been in business for over 25 years has always got a few options in terms of those stories to tell.
Well, they have if they're honest, yes.
Yeah, I've certainly got quite a few. I thought probably the most interesting one, because it combines the professional and the personal, was my experience as a startup founder. It combines a sort of sense of professional failure, but also a sense of personal failure, thankfully both of which now overcome. But at the time, I mean, probably one of the most difficult, if not the most difficult point in my professional career.
So give us a sense of what was going on and a bit of background and context then.
So rewind to about 2008. I was running what was a micro digital agency. There was 2.5 of us, 2 people and 1 person we were just about to recruit, when we met the bosses of an advertising agency, a marketing agency really, that employed a very capable chap called Phil Lewis at one point. And they said to us, look, we've tried a couple of times to start a digital arm, and digital agencies were all the rage in the sort of mid to late noughties. Hasn't quite worked out. Can we effectively bring you on board as our digital arm? And so we did a deal where we ended up with shares in this new digital arm of the business. They ended up with shares in the digital arm of the business. We moved into their very sexy new offices, and we started to work with their clients, and we grew very quickly as a result. But while we were there, in fact, even before we joined up with that business to form what became And Digital, there is now another business called And Digital, but it wasn't that one. Even before that, we'd come across a problem with our clients in digital marketing, which is it was a version of the age-old problem, which is we never knew which bits of our marketing budget were being wasted. And so I came up with this idea really for a software product to try and solve this problem, a web analytics product that would track in great depth who was coming to your website, where they were coming from, when they were coming back, and really give you a much better idea, particularly of your digital marketing spend, what was valuable and what was not. And so I'd sat down with a friend of mine, Tim, and we'd come up with this idea that became a business called Candy. And we started it on the side of the digital agency as the digital agency was growing. And Tim got quite enthusiastic about it. And then there was an opportunity to go and join a startup accelerator up in Middlesbrough. In fact, the UK's first startup accelerator called the Difference Engine. So I, was committed to running this digital agency and, contracted and everything else. So I couldn't go up to the startup accelerator, but Tim did. Tim decamped his whole family, little baby and all, and went up to Middlesbrough, did this accelerator. And that was really the point where Candy as a business became Tim's baby more than mine. Fast forward 12 months, and it turned out that the ad agency who'd acquired my digital agency was not in good financial shape. And I think they'd probably been disguising that from themselves as much as anyone. I don't think it was particularly nefarious. But that business went under. And a little while before it went under, I decided to leave and went full time at the startup. So I left my digital agency, years of my work building a business that only 18 months after effectively selling it had collapsed. And so I was already in a little bit of a downer at that point. But went off to join this exciting new startup that I'd co-founded. Still at that point as sort of joint main shareholder. We'd raised some investment. I'd say more through Tim's expertise than mine. Tim brought two things to the party: an MBA and a knowledge of venture capital and money and the finance side of things, and the technical expertise to build the product as well. And I brought the idea and the marketing nous, at least in theory, to go and sell the product. And I so sort of slotted into a full-time role as chief marketing officer and co-founder, and set about trying to find us customers for this product that Tim had built. And I did on a small scale. I got, all of our first customers pretty much by just doing the hard yards of going out, selling, finding people, chatting, networking, going through my existing relationships and building those relationships, things I still do effectively today. But what I totally failed to do was to scale that approach, to find a way to sell this product, software as a service, still a relatively new term at this point, to large numbers of people. I'd been doing content-driven marketing for years, didn't find a way to make that work. I didn't really know enough about pay-per-click advertising, but tried that and experimented with that and didn't make it work. And so progressively over the course of a year, 18 months that I was in that business full-time, was after a while, failing to try new things and just trying the same things, but working harder and harder and harder. Sort of running out of ideas, relying on just an excess of effort. And every which way I went, not succeeding.
I remember reading an interview years ago. This is going to sound a bit random, but I remember reading an interview a few years ago around REM, the band REM, and their worst album by common consensus is an album called Around the Sun. And I remember reading about the recording process of Around the Sun. And apparently the way that Michael Stipe, the lead singer, described it was, we just kept doubling down on the material. And the more that we doubled down on the material, the more we worked harder on the material, the more the material seemed to recede from view, which I thought was really interesting. And I thought about that a lot in terms of my own business journey. And it comes up again listening to you, actually, that thing of like, we double down and we're doubling down and we're doubling down. And it doesn't feel like it's working, but, God damn it, we're just going to keep applying the spanners until the damn thing shifts, or whatever. And that feels like maybe what you're trying to do here.
Yeah, I was. And it didn't work. And so it was damaging to my own sort of confidence. And I think my co-founder, Tim, would admit he's quite an abrasive person to work with, which didn't make it any easier. But I was working endless hours, 60, 70 hours trying to make this thing work, but without success, which meant that I was not at home when I should have been for my wife and my very young family. I had two very young daughters at that point. I was exhausted. I was not doing the fun things I like to do, which keep me sane. And it was this sort of spiral of, well, this isn't working. I need to work harder. Working harder isn't working. Well, you need to work harder still. And like you say, just sort of doubling down and doubling down. And, this really continued for kind of right up to the end of 2011, when I realized, and I think I don't think she'll mind me relaying this. And I don't think my wife actually told me this at the time, but she told me later. My eldest daughter, talking at this point, said to my wife, Mummy, is Daddy going to visit us from work today? which was, when I heard it, just absolutely soul destroying. It was really, really painful to hear. But I was sort of aware that things weren't right and things had to change. Unfortunately, my co-founder and the investors had come to the same conclusion at the end of 2011. And we quite quickly reached an agreement that I was going to go. I was going to sell some of my shares back to the business in return for some cash to give me a little float. And I was going to work out what on earth I was going to do next, which turned out to be going full-time as a futurist. But to walk away from my second idea, the second thing that I'd founded in failure in the space of 3 years was really hard, really hard, even though I was utterly miserable and desperate to get out.
And how did it feel to hear that?
I have a terrible memory, Phil. I don't remember a lot of things. I rely on photographs and videos, and frankly, my wife's much better memory. That will never, ever leave me. Never leave me. It was heartbreaking, soul destroying, use any set of adjectives you want. And it has been probably a pillar of, or the foundation of, my commitment to my relationship with my children since. Because children aren't always fun, right? Like it's not always fun to focus on them. There's sometimes other things you want to do, and you should do as a parent. You should have hobbies. You should have time to yourself. But when they need you, when they want you, particularly when they're really young, sometimes you need that extra motivation to go, okay, I'll get my ass off the sofa. And yeah, that was motivation for sure.
One of the things that you were talking about doubling down, I wanted to just revisit with you, because one of the central dilemmas, I think, for anybody who's doing a startup or anything which is innovative, is that sometimes it feels like nothing's working until things start to work. I remember hearing a speaker years ago, and somebody asked him the question, if you're digging for gold, how do you know if you're 3 feet away, 3 inches away, or in the wrong mine entirely? And he said, well, if we all knew the answer to that question, we'd all be, billionaires by Christmas. And we're not. We're sat here in some meeting room in Slough trying to wonder how we do all this stuff a bit better. So it's one of those things, isn't it? When you're in that world, the doubling down, it comes from a kind of healthy place, which is grit and determination. And actually, because sometimes you do just need to find that resourcefulness to keep going.
Yeah.
On the other hand, as you're also talking about, you're accruing cost. Actually, there's an energetic cost. There is a cost sometimes to family life, which you talked about. And it is not obvious that any of the stuff that you're doing is working or is going to work. And the signals are always quite ambiguous. And again, if you're out there talking to customers in the world that you're in, people will tell you things are interesting, and they'll tell you that this sounds like a really interesting proposition and all of that. And so you're getting this quite ambiguous data, I think, a lot of the time too. And I'm wondering what your internal narrative was around all of that, if you can recall it, and how did you transition from that kind of grit and determination and this is going to work? What ultimately got you to a point where you were like, hang on, this isn't working and something needs to change?
I think part of the problem was that my experience had always been of low volume, high value sales. I'd run this digital agency. I'd been quite senior in an agency before that. I was selling, really consultative propositions, only selling a handful a year, which was all that was needed to grow the business. And what this software business needed was something quite different. I wouldn't say it was low value, high volume, but it was sort of moderate value, moderate volume. And I didn't really understand the requirements to change the sales and marketing process to support that because I'd never done it. And what I should have done is probably go and find a mentor or an agency or someone with a direct experience of doing that. But at the same time, there weren't that many around back in sort of
Mm.
2009, 10. It wasn't, I didn't know lots of people who built a SaaS business at that point. You can go and find armfuls of them now, but they weren't really around so much at that point. I think the tipping point for me was actually purely personal. It was, I don't have the mental capacity to keep going with this, and nor do my family. Like, my wife doesn't have the capacity for me to keep going with this. So even if another 12 months of digging for gold in that mine might have paid off, it just wasn't an option.
The cost just wasn't worth the effort in the end, and that's a really reasonable position, I think, to land in. No.
Yeah, although I think it's also interesting that I wasn't the only one to come to that conclusion. I think the investors had come to that conclusion as well. They wanted to see more traction. They wanted to see results. And so I always joke with people that I took an assisted leap out of this business. I jumped and they pushed.
Yeah.
And it was very much a mutual thing in the end, but I think they were ready to get rid of me and I was ready to go. And actually, there's sort of schadenfreude because I still wanted the business to succeed, obviously. And the business did succeed in the end. In fact, it's just been sold. It's just been sold again. Tim, my co-founder, has just sold the business. I exited a long time ago now, the rest of my shares. But they brought in someone to replace me and he lasted 6 months. I think from memory, before realizing he couldn't do it either. So I felt sort of slightly vindicated in that. It turned out it was a hard problem to solve.
Mm.
But what was really interesting is I then set up shop as a futurist, and as you know, I've been broadcasting about the future and writing about the future for 6 years at this point. And so I set up shop as a futurist, and my friend Stuart helped me put together a website saying I'm the Applied Futurist. This is what I do.
Mm.
And I did nothing else. So within the first 6 weeks, I had inquiries out the door from incredible brands that I would have dreamed of selling our software to. And, having not really done anything different, selling a very different proposition, but not really used any different methods, any different approach. I'd gone from, effectively trying to run this software down people's throats and trying to convince people that it was a great thing for them, to having put out a very simple proposition, having people come to me. And I think that was, in some ways, I learned that we'd never quite got the messaging right around the software, and yet somehow I'd stumbled on a message that was right and timely. And it comes back to your point about how do I know how far below the ground the gold is? Was I digging in the wrong mine? I don't know, but I think gold was a bit sparse in that mine, perhaps, and it took a lot of digging to find it. And I
Or you weren't the
basically,
right miner. I mean,
or I wasn't the right miner.
that's the other reality, isn't it? I mean, there's a lot in what you were saying. I mean, I was reflecting when you were talking before about there weren't many people who built SaaS businesses around, and I'm there going, well, part of the problem with being a pioneer is that you're a pioneer. They always say innovators freeze to death or end up with arrows in their back. It's like there's that kind of dilemma going on, but there's
Yeah.
also the dilemma of what you learned was some very expensive lessons. By the sounds of it, you learned those lessons for yourself, but you also learned them for the business because, of course, yes, the next person who came in struggled as well. But in the end, by the sounds of it, the business did actually crack a way of doing this that succeeded. So nothing's ever wasted. All the stuff that you tried clearly ultimately contributed to the success of this thing.
Yes.
But by the same token, the cost of that energetically, the cost of that to family life, the cost of it to your own sense of equanimity and well-being. And I wanted to honor what you said as well about, I've been there personally, that sense of multiple failures in quite a short period of time. They compound, don't they? And it sort of feels like emotionally one is a multiplier on another. That's been my experience anyway.
Yes.
So you there's been if in investment terms, we think about the delta, the amount of money that needs to be spent before we move back. There's also kind of an energetic delta for founders, I think, sometimes. And it sounds like in your case, in this particular instance, you drove hard into that delta and didn't necessarily get to see the upside of it in the time that you were
Yeah.
there.
I mean, what was really interesting, they did change approach completely after I left and after the second guy didn't manage it either. And what succeeded for the end was telesales,
Oh, interesting.
which honestly is not an approach I probably would have tried.
Yes, you're not really a telesalesman. I mean, that's, and I mean, that's a
Right.
compliment, Tom.
but that's what worked for them in the end, for the type of customer they needed and for the type of sales process they needed. And it was a relatively expensive sales process, but it was profitable. And I think that was really interesting that it actually, the final success wasn't something I would have tried, but I did exhaust a lot of avenues while I was there. Yeah, you're right. I think the thing about the right miner is interesting. I wasn't well equipped to do the job that it turned out needed doing, but we didn't really know what the job was when I started. We didn't know how to define it, and I didn't have in my sort of toolbox the full range of avenues we could have tested. And I think that is the difference between, a really good CMO, really good chief marketing officer understands all of those avenues, can step back and look at them going, well, that's not working. What does this look like? How do I put something like that in place? And I don't think I would ever, it's probably too late in my life now to even do that, but I don't think I would have set myself up as a CMO, after that. I don't think I would try and be that person. There was a group of things. The other thing was doing things that I enjoy. Like, work should be fun. I'm a strong believer. It should at the very least be rewarding, and I was doing fewer and fewer of the things that actually I found enjoyable and rewarding as part of the job. And that sort of amplified how much the hours were exhausting.
My husband often says that one of the central problems with life is you weren't born experienced, right? Just also wanted to honor what you said as well around family life in all of this, because again, I think it's something that as people who run our own businesses, we actually don't talk enough about a lot of the time. The number of founders and actually senior people as well they may not own their businesses outright, they may have investors, or they may be on some sort of exit track, or in some cases actually have gone down that road and still be working for whatever reason. But the levels of trade-off that are going on around family life, around seeing kids, around any kind of sense of balance are quite colossal. And the narratives, I think, that we can tell ourselves as business owners, I mean, there's a narrative about, productivity and the relationship between productivity and hard work, which I think is important. But I also think there are other things that perhaps are more relevant to this conversation today, which we can tell ourselves, which are things like, I'm doing all this for my family. So there's a degree of I'm paying now. So actually there's going to be some benefit later on. And that's a tremendously difficult circle to square for a lot of people, I think, because growing a business is energetically demanding. Running a business is energetically demanding. There are going to be certain trade-offs that you have to make, particularly if you have, genuine ambition or financial aspiration or whatever it is as well. And if nothing else comes out of this conversation this morning, I do hope that people listen to this and go, I'm not the only person who struggled with that if they're struggling with it in their own life and their own work. And I think one of the things that your story beautifully illuminates, Tom, is the fact that actually it is possible to find a way of doing something which is genuinely innovative, but something that is more sustaining of family life as well. We don't have to be in the world of, I built a successful business, but I ended up divorced and my children dislike me, which I think is more common. And I say that with absolute compassion, because I think it's so much more common than you want it to be or it needs to be,
Yeah. I have to be careful what I say here. I have fallen into, in some ways, my particular life path, skill set, some moments of serendipity into, not, yes, a huge amount of effort, but a good chunk of luck as well, has landed me into a career where I can work from home most of the time, where I could, where I cook my family dinner every night, where I can do the washing, where I can shoulder a genuine 50% of the burden of family life as well as earning a living. And I was not even close to that for the first 3 years, more than 3 years actually, because I wasn't doing that at the age when I was trying to grow the agency. I certainly wasn't doing it when I was at the startup. And people talk about their children a lot. I think what they don't talk about is their partner and the incredible sacrifices Monica, my wife, made while I was trying to do those things, and how much of a burden it placed on her, me trying to grow these two businesses. With her consent, she knew what I was trying to do and she understood some of that trade-off. But I think even with that consent, I don't think it was ultimately fair. I don't think it was right. And I'm very, very happy that, having come out of that, I stumbled into a career that allows us to have a much, much better balance. And obviously the relationship that I now have with my kids is enormously important to me. But I think people underestimate how much their partners, often unseen, undertake in the face of those choices.
To round us out, Tom, when you look back at the candy experience, what do you take from it now?
I take it as a really important part of my CV. Lots of the things I've done over my career, from a degree in mechatronic engineering to 5 years in PR and marketing to running a digital agency to the startup, what they've done is they've given me credibility in what I do now. And failures do that as much as successes, I think, in many ways, sometimes more. I learned an enormous amount from that process. I look back on it as a really difficult period, a really painful period, but one that I don't think I would be as successful doing what I do now without it. And you have to cast it in that light retrospectively. You can't dwell on it. You can't, think about what might have been. You say, I did that. I learned a lot. Yes, it was painful, but it wouldn't be where I am now without it.
And if you were to give one piece of advice to somebody who is going to embark upon a candy-like venture, what would it be?
I think you probably have to accept and prepare for the fact that it is going to be all-consuming, at least for a period. But I think you should put a hard stop on that period. I think you should go into it with a contract with yourself and your partner, if you have one, about at what point you review that level of commitment. You say, okay, after 6 months, after 9 months, whenever it may be, we're going to do a proper hard review of whether this is worth it, what damage it's doing, and whether it's time to make a change. In order to avoid that doubling down, I think you should do it with your business partner as well. I think we probably could have been franker with each other then about what wasn't working. But yeah, set yourself a timer about how long that commitment is worth it and review how much damage it's doing. I don't think I was wrong to be working 60, 70 hours a week and putting that effort in. I just wish I'd stopped doing it sooner.
Tom, thank you for your honesty, the generosity of your insight. I know it's going to help other people listening to this podcast. It's been, as always, lovely to talk to you. So,
likewise. Cheers, Phil.
A big thanks to Tom for being so courageous and so generous in sharing his story. For part 2 of this episode, I'm joined by the coach and consultant, Kayleigh Basford. Kayleigh brings over 2 decades of change and transformation leadership acquired in a range of FTSE 100 companies. She's also a highly experienced coach practitioner, working with a range of leaders in organisations, both large and small. Kayleigh, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
It was quite a listen, wasn't it, that conversation? I don't know about you, but it sat with me for a while afterwards, and I found myself quite wondering as to why it was sat with me for such a long time afterwards. And I don't know if your emotional response to it was the same as mine, but yeah, there was a kind of, I felt quite sort of heavy listening to it. Like there was something genuinely being worked out there in a way.
Yeah, in coaching, we talk about the field and what's going on in the field around other people's emotions versus our own. And similar to you, I really felt a huge amount of empathy for Tom. In fact, I got a lump in my throat a couple of times. And I was thinking about, is it because I could feel what was going on in the field for him, or was it pressing a button for me? And I think the reality is it was probably a bit of both. I think we've probably all had experiences similar to him around things not working out and feeling the way he was feeling. Certainly when he spoke about his daughter and how it would stay with him for a very, very long time, I definitely felt that.
Yeah, I mean the sort of family element of this is and that relationship between the professional and the personal, and how one inevitably bleeds into the other. I think in almost all of our lives, whether you're working for yourself, whether you're in a startup, whether you're in a big corporate, this idea of, I've always rebelled against this idea of work-life balance, because in my head it's all just life. And the idea that we can sort of leave work at the door in contemporary sort of knowledge work particularly, I think is really for the birds a lot of the time. And we often, I don't think we talk enough or acknowledge enough in business the way that the personal can impact the professional can impact the personal. And that was a definite theme in that conversation. And I'd like to pick that up with you. Just before we get there, the other thing I wanted just to think about together, though, is you mentioned about it can kind of have an impact on, it's what's going on in the field can have an impact on us as coaches and consultants. And are we picking up what's going on for someone else? Or are we picking up what's going on for us? Certainly what resonated with me was there's the element of his story about doubling down, working harder, never quite sure that the rewards were going to come, getting to a point where you're not even sure that the rewards are worthwhile. And I found myself going, oh God, I've been there so many times. And the struggle to sort of work through both the lived experience of that and actually the consequences of that has been very real in my life sometimes. And talk more about coping strategies for all that stuff as this conversation goes forward. But that was the thing that really sat with me, I think, from a resonance point of view. And what that gets to, I think, is, well, is that about Tom's story? Is that about my own story? And what am I really having a response to here? Which is what you're alluding to,
Yeah. And I'm exactly the same. And you've hit the nail on the head for me around the bit that kind of made me really feel emotion for him. It was interesting because my experience is different to his, but it's the same, that feeling trapped and trying to kind of stay on the treadmill, even though you are feeling totally lost or not sure what to do. And the thing that I thought was interesting about it was really, I think what we were dealing with there for Tom was a trauma response to his experiences. It was interesting for me that he came into that at a low ebb. He came into that new business. His digital marketing business had failed. He'd then kind of moved into this new business. So he was already going in at a low ebb, and then it's just not working. And so it was really interesting for me, maybe not a full trauma response, but certainly from a systems point of view, his drive system and his fight, flight, freeze, fawn response was really interesting. I felt that he was sitting in flight a lot, that feeling of, I have to keep going, I have to keep going, I have to keep going. And that's actually a trauma response. And I don't think we talk enough about how work can create those types of responses in people. Interestingly, I was talking to my therapist the other day because I like to do a bit of mind maintenance. And we were talking about an oldie but a goodie, which is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And, right at the bottom is safety and security, and work comes into that. So if you're starting to feel like you're not doing a good job, really low down in our needs as human beings, it can start to make us feel really, really uncomfortable. It's how you pay your bills. It's how you pay for food. And so my take on it was, and I think it was similar to my own experiences, was that Tom started to go towards that kind of, I'm in flight, I have to just keep going, I have to keep going, I have to keep going. And I think that's why it probably did evoke emotion for you and I, because that is a type of trauma response. I don't know what you think to that, but that was kind of my take from it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the word trauma needs quite careful definition, doesn't it?
Yes.
Because there is a categorical difference between a trauma response and the response to what you might describe as a generic negative experience, and the over therapization of everyday language helps kind of nobody.
Totally
and
agree.
A trauma response, and I do this kind of work as well, increasingly around organizational trauma and thinking and looking at that in my own work, is, as you're alluding to, the idea of an existentially threatening event that exceeds the ability of the individual or the group of individuals to, in some sense, cope with that in a way that ultimately creates whether it's a combination of, neurological, emotional, psychological responses to future stimulus that are, still alive and present in the historic reaction to that trauma, or drawn through from their historic reaction to that trauma, probably more accurately. And that feels relevant here, I think, because what you're saying quite rightly is there is an existentially threatening event there, right? Fundamentally, you've gone through failure of one business, and failures always, unless you're extremely lucky, end up being financially punishing to a greater or lesser extent, or at least destabilizing in terms of one's sense of self and one's sense of security. And then you go into something else, and that doesn't work either. And he talked really eloquently and I thought very bravely about that actually in the story, which was, here I was at quite a low ebb, as you say, and then actually something else goes on and that's not working either. And, family, young kids, all the rest of it. And yeah, I'm careful about labeling somebody else's experience in absentia, as I know you are, but at the same time, to be able to go, that must have been a profoundly impacting event. And the other thing I would say on it is this idea of hypervigilance as well is the other thing it brought up for me as a kind of trauma-based response. So in organizational theory, we think about, hypervigilance and hypovigilance being a kind of one being that kind of relentless drive and busyness and getting stuff done, and the other one being a kind of listless sort of sense of drift. And again, you see both of those present at work, I think, a lot of the time. But this idea of hypervigilance felt very relevant here too, didn't it?
It did.
You talk about it being in the sort of, in the fight, flight, freeze kind of thing. But I found myself thinking, no, it's just that relentless focus on work, double down. And that's completely understandable from a response to an existentially threatening event perspective. And again, one that I find myself going, God, been there more times than I probably want to acknowledge sometimes, it's just a really, it's a sticky wicket, that one, isn't it?
And I think that's why I felt for him. I mean, I think you're absolutely right not labeling this trauma, and labels isn't my favorite thing anyway. But if I was to say his threat system was activated, it feels like that for me. And the thing that's so interesting about that for business, I think, is you're flooding your body with cortisol when your amygdala goes alarm, alarm, and then cortisol starts coming into your body. But the thing that's super interesting, for someone who used to run design thinking workshops in my old life in the corporate world, is it literally shuts down your prefrontal cortex, which is the bit that you need active for planning. It's the bit you need active for sort of thinking logically, and the opposite of what you need in order to be creative. So for Tom to say he kept doing the same things over and over again, there is a link here for me in that threat system, which I think is so relevant to business. We've got to have that serotonin. We've got to have that stuff going around our body in order to relax enough to be creative. And I thought it was super interesting that he left. He started napping. He said, did all the same things. But for me, that's because his threat response was starting to calm down. And so he could be more creative. He could relax. He could relax into creating something really special by the sounds of things. And I always, when I used to run design thinking workshops, used to have to try and relax people in order to get them into coming up with ideas. And this is why psychological safety is so important in business, because if you're making people feel scared through your business practices, you are shutting down their ability to think, quite literally. And you and I both know as coaches that that's our job, is to help people think, time to think. But it surprises me how often I don't just hear Tom's story, but I hear client stories, the way that the leadership is making them feel threatened. I had a friend, actually, I don't think she'll mind me saying, whose boss told her that he could make her life difficult if he wanted to. And you think that is doing the opposite of what you need to do in business to help people be at their best. So that was the thing that really stood out for me. And I think you're right, threat system is probably a better way of kind of categorizing it. But it's so important. And it's interesting to me that you're working with organizational trauma, because I think it's so important, particularly with the world as it is today. Without going too macro, I worry about these people who are in government, and things like, being worried that you're going to have to step down from roles if you don't do a good job. You're hindering people's ability to think, quite literally, from a neuroscience point of view.
I was listening back to the conversation and I was thinking to myself, I'm really feeling a lot here. Like this is really activating something in me. It did as when I was recording it with Tom as well, actually. And it got me really reflecting on my own resourcefulness, because of course, because my own response to things not going terribly well in my own work has been double down. And the thing I struggle with the most is rest, always has been. Not helped by my deep and abiding passion for my work as well, it must be said. You end up asking yourself that kind of classic question, or what I think is a classic question, which is, if this was going on right now in a coaching environment or in a consulting environment, whose work would be being done here? Because actually what I'm feeling, that sense of empathy, really points in me towards, actually, no, this is an ongoing area for care and attention, and something I need to really be vigilant around in my own practice and my own thinking. And his story really brought home to me the fact I've still got work to do in that space, actually, myself. So it really got me reflecting on that in my own practice. And I don't know what you feel about that, but my sense of it is there's never any time we can spend as coaches or consultants or helpers in any sense, which is not spent usefully if we are reflecting on what is the relationship that we've got with this material, what is it pointing us to in ourselves, how do we want to deal with that, and crucially, how do we make sure that we are here in service of the other, not just in service of ourselves,
Yeah. I mean, I had a very similar response to you. It made me reflect on my own experiences, and I know what it did for me, if you don't mind me sharing. In 2020, I had cancer, and I was working for a big corporate, and I decided to try and do my way out of that situation, just do. And that was actually a life-threatening situation, genuine one. And I worked all the way through it, and I started at the same time at this firm as the time that I found out I had cancer. So I started, and I was driving up, having radiotherapy, and then coming to work to learn the job. And then the pandemic hit and everything got cancelled until I had chemo. And then I had chemo for the rest of 2020, and it was quite a who am I question when you're having things like that. How's life going to be? And again, I still tried to just, drive system my way out of this situation, working through chemo, all sorts of things. But I never took any time off work, and I just kept going. And again, I was trying to drive my system, my drive system was trying to help me do myself out feeling the way I was feeling by doing what I'd always done, which is try and be successful at work, do your best at work, do a good job, be a good leader, all that kind of stuff that I was passionate about. And in the end, I got burnout, and I had to really think about, how do I reset my view on myself, reset my purpose. It's actually been brilliant, because that's why I became a coach. I had a real think about a bit of an existential think. But I think the thing that's relevant to this, and why it was pressing a button for me, was, we spoke about that point where he kind of stepped out and then he started napping. And the way that I had to get myself out of that burnout was to really tap into my soothe system. And I'm extremely grateful to a very good therapist who helped me realize that, which is, if you're doing that, keep going, keep going, keep going. And mine arguably was a very extreme situation. A pandemic and cancer plus new job is pretty extreme. But burnouts, it's a real thing. And I'm very glad for Tom that he got out, because it's very impactful. Really thinking about how we can tap into our soothe system is important. I learned this from my therapist, if I'm lucky to give her a shout out. We have 3 types of systems. We've got a threat system, a drive system, and a soothe system. The threat system we've already spoken about, and our drive system is kind of our need to achieve, I guess, have purpose. And we have different neurological chemicals that drive these systems. The third one is the soothe system, which is our ability to self-care. Self-care is spoken about quite a lot, but it really is important, because when we have balance of all 3 things, threat, drive, and soothe, that's actually when we can be at our best. It's when we can be creative. But if your nervous system's burnt out, like mine did, you really need to balance the scales. And so your soothe system is about tapping in to trying to relax, connect with people, be around people that you feel psychologically safe with. In the business world, if you are stuck in your drive system, which can happen because we are told to be productive, we're told, the new targets come out and they were bigger than the year before, our soothe system can get completely forgotten about. And I think for Tom, spending time with his family was tricky. So things like that were starting to be forgotten about. And I think he tapped back into that when he left.
My heart really goes out to the 2020 Kayle's dealing with cancer and the pandemic. And thank you for sharing that. That must have been one hell of a time. And I use that phrase very deliberately. I found myself reflecting as you were talking about that, about this idea of the drive system. And you sort of alluded to it in the end there, about what's really going on behind it for a lot of us. And I found myself wondering, not for the first time, is it fear of stopping? That if we allow ourselves to stop, then the thing that we're really confronted with is how we feel about the nature of the experience that we have had or we are currently having. And I sensed that a little bit in Tom's story, and I found myself wondering about it listening to you as well, Kayleigh, because it's like, if I stop, then I sometimes have to face the things I don't want to have to face, or at least that's the kind of the thought pattern that sort of goes on, and those questions that it brings up can be quite profound. They can also be questions around our purpose. You alluded to this drive for productivity that we have. I mean, one interesting question is, how do we evaluate the value of a life? Because in capitalist societies, it tends to be our economic productivity is a huge part of our personal value, which is a completely morally and intellectually bankrupt way to evaluate the value of a life. But that is a different podcast to this one, I think. But nevertheless, it's all those sorts of questions. Or also just, I'm having a really rough time here. And if I have to step into the sadness and the grief of all of that, is that itself going to feel overwhelming for me? And so the drive response can just keep us going and keep us going and keep us going, I think, in that moment. Alleviation of threat, I think, is certainly part of what I would do in my consulting work, for example. Like, I see my job in that context sometimes is to look around corners before my clients do and help them anticipate what might be on the way. The drive thing I have to watch, because I'm so driven myself. I have to be very careful in my client relationships not to accelerate that with clients and magnify that. But I do find myself wondering about the idea of the coach as somebody that can support soothing, somebody who can create
Yeah.
that space and hold and make it okay for and be a caring kind of presence actually in somebody's life. And the word coach is so unhelpful, isn't it? Because it's such a small and reductive word. But actually, the idea of coaching as a coach being in the business of care, I think, is something that we're all well placed to internalize sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. I guess one of my most profound experiences after I left the corporate world and I was training and I'd had this experience myself, was actually helping a client or a coachee just be is one of the most important things I think we can do as coaches. As you say, tap into their system. I quite like practicing Gestalt with clients that like it, with coachees that like it, which is about tapping into, their subconscious a bit more. And I use mindfulness with coachees as well when they're comfortable to do that. Not all coachees are comfortable to do that. But I think coaching could be at risk of helping someone stay in that drive system and do. And I think it's our job as coaches to help people recognize when the do is relevant and when it's actually starting to be a pattern that they're stuck in, that potentially is driving them into the ground as opposed to driving them forward. So it's interesting for me, having just moved to a different culture. I live in the Middle East now, just starting to see those different cultures as well. And it's a mishmash where I live. And it's definitely very much, if you think about, most of my clients are in the West, what we say is success, and people having those kind of existential thoughts around purpose. Just stopping and moving away from that drive system can be very helpful about thinking, what do we actually want?
The best definition of love I ever heard was allowing what is to be. And I think that's a lovely definition of love, that, to allow what is to be. And again, it's sort of a weird thing to talk about love in the context of work, right? We tend to think of love as being the kind of very kind of Cupid's arrow sort of definition of love. But if you think about like the medievalists, for example, they would think about love as being the highest form of attainable good, which I think is actually a much more healthy definition. And I think about the kind of work we do ultimately as loving work, which is to say we allow what is to be in service of the highest form of attainable good. And if we go back to what was interesting about listening to the story in the first half of this episode as well, is that the opposite of that might be something like loneliness, isolation, fear, threat, all of those sorts of things, all of which are very kind of present in that story. And again, I want to go back to where we started, perhaps in closing, just to pick up on that point around family, because what was also fascinating about the drive system, the story, everything else, there's this horrible, heartbreaking moment where Will Daddy visits us from work today, where there's a sense, I think, in that, and Tom acknowledges this in his own story, that it will never leave him. And actually, it turned out to be a good thing, because it was a catalyst for what has clearly been a very loving relationship and a very close relationship with his children since. But there was this time of like a sense of isolation and distance from that really loving nucleus of a life as well that's going on. So that drive system driving us away from that which actually nurtures us as well, I think, is very present in stories like that. But I also just wanted to pick up on the point you made at the beginning, which was around the idea of, actually work distancing us from our families, and how challenging that can be for high performers, and what we all do about that. You said it resonated with you too.
Yeah, it really did. When a few years ago, my husband moved abroad and I was at home with my son. Again, I was still in the corporate world and I was just never there. We had a nanny. And, a similar thing happened to me where I just thought, he never sees either of us now. This was not the aim. And I'm willing to fundamentally change the way I'm working now, because that was not the aim. And I think, my sense for Tom, and, he can maybe correct me if I'm wrong, was a big watershed moment for him as well. That this is, like I say, a bucket of cold water. But I also wanted to pick up on something you said around emotion, if that's okay. It's always made me laugh that in business we sort of try and move away from emotion. And actually it couldn't be more relevant. The fact that we don't want to talk about emotion in business has always surprised me, and I've always thought it's quite, it's almost hypocrisy, because we need to talk about it to create brands and products and services that people love. And we need to have people invest in the business and feel psychologically safe in order to get the best out of them. So it couldn't be more relevant to me, emotion in business. And I think there is, as you say, this crossover between family life and business. And I think we, as coaches, can help people be very aware of the crossover there and how they need to have the balance there. Talk about the soothe system as we tap into the soothe system as we've suggested, in order to be their best everywhere. And by best, I mean, I guess best for me is sort of homeostasis, feeling balanced, feeling good.
So talking about being at our best, I think, as always, our job in the second half of this podcast is to try and extract some insights for our listeners to take forward. The things that I take away from this conversation, Kayleigh, 2 or 3 things I take away from this conversation. One is about really paying attention to the soothe system as an integral part of our makeup and something that needs care and attention, and also when we give it care and attention can amplify our creativity. So that feels like a really important thing to be paying attention to for anybody who's genuinely interested in high performance. The second thing that I take away is perhaps one that's relevant for any of us who are in coaching, consulting, or helping, which is that idea of congruency, really. So ultimately, what's going on in us in response to what we are hearing from others, and what is that telling us about the nature of the work that we need to do, both in the moment with the people that we're seeking to serve, but also in service of ourselves, being able to be functional human beings in the world, but also then being able to look after the clients that we want to look after. So those are my 2 big takeaways from what I think has been a really rich conversation. How about yourself?
Yeah, similar. I think thinking about what's happening for me and what's happening for my client is something that I feel very passionately about. In fact, I check in before I go into any coaching session just to make sure I know how I'm feeling before I go in. So that's something that I'm always passionate about. And this is because I think there's a risk for me as a coach, and I think this is a very, very common risk of rescuing people. So I need to check where I go in and where the line is around making sure that I'm supporting them and coaching them, not trying to solve it for them. And so that falls part of that for me. And actually, I was very grateful to listen to this because it made me think about that. But probably the biggest takeout for me by far was, Tom made me really think about supporting people and facilitating them to tap into that soothe system, not just try and coach their way out of it. Almost some people will come to coaching like, right, I'm having coaching now. How can we solve this? And actually just slowing things down and helping them tap into those different systems when it's relevant, drive, threat, and soothe, is incredibly important. And so I'm super grateful for listening to this, actually, because it really made me think about some of my clients right now who I need to help tap into their soothe system potentially.
Kayleigh, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I've loved it.
A big thanks to Kayleigh and also to Tom. Hopefully some useful insights in there for you as you consider your own approach to leadership, particularly if that drive system is in, overdrive right now. If you found value in this podcast, please hit the subscribe button and feel free to pass on the good news to anyone and frankly everyone you know. This is a new podcast, so all shares, ratings, reviews, recommendations via carrier pigeon mean a huge amount to us. Thanks in advance. And I will see you next month for another episode of the Phil Lewis Podcast. Bye for now.